according to this book, central planning has a way of stamping out on-the-ground knowledge. And I think the way our current system with its power to the powerful dynamic is playing out, it's having a similar effect. And as an example, we might consider the difference between an expert chef with their on-the-ground knowledge, which has to pay careful attention to when something is just about to smoke and what does something look like when it's about to boil and how does food smell when it's getting to the right place. That type of knowledge versus like a fast food restaurant and the style of food cooked there that does not really require any on-the-ground knowledge. And as a matter of fact, it is specifically designed to design out that kind of knowledge, which this author calls Metis. And another example would be like a teacher who designs her classroom based on her intuition for what these students need and her creativity and her experience of how to motivate students versus what a school administration comes in and does when they say, this is how the classroom is to be run. Now, what is this Metis he's talking about? Where Metis is the kind of knowledge that you have to experience to understand, that you can't really just tell somebody in words to give them instructions. You kind of have to coach them by watching them do it and letting them learn from their own experience. It's the kind of knowledge that is very responsive to its environment and oftentimes responsive to the human element of its environment. So here we're thinking about playing soccer on a soccer field where you're responding to the situation and the people you're working with, or the expertise of a hand surgeon doing surgery and learning from experience how to get better at that. We're thinking about a teacher who's teaching karate lessons to kids and their knowledge about how to develop rapport with a group of 7-year-olds. Or like a violinist learning this on-the-ground knowledge about how to play the violin, not just on their own, but in response to the other people in the orchestra and the orchestra instructor and feeling out the music. And this kind of knowledge, this kind of experience that goes with learning something like this is the essence of vibrancy in a society. It's attached to meaning for so many people as they learn to develop these kinds of skills that have this type of knowledge. And yet, the system we live underneath right now is really stamping out that kind of knowledge. As a matter of fact, if you ask the question, what do people want from their work? And what do they want from their job? Is it just money or is it something else? And in his book, Drive by Daniel Pink, he comes up with an answer to that, which is that people want autonomy, mastery, and purpose in their jobs. And that this is something that is valued even above money for most people. And when you look at that list, mastery, that's mastery of a skill. This really does relate to this Metis idea of this on-the-ground knowledge. Autonomy, that's what you need to actually be responding to the environment according to your own judgment that you're learning through this skill you're mastering. And purpose is associated with being in right relationship with the people around you and the people you're serving through your work. So in many ways, is this force motivational? Yes, this force might actually be way, way more motivational than money is. It's really the essence of human drive. And yet our system is stamping it out in favor of control from a more centralized standpoint. And this isn't just Amazon workers. This includes things like doctors who once had a lot of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But with the administrative system that's sort of the apparatus over the healthcare system, that's kind of crowding out even doctors' ability to use their own best judgment based on long years of experience. So in this video, I want to dive into the question of how and why do centrally planned systems crowd out or engineer out the Metis, this on-the-ground knowledge? And that includes our own system, so we'll ask some questions related to that. So where am I going with this? And first, just more about what is Metis, and then what is a centralized system? Why does our current system seem to count as a centralized system? And finally, I want to look at two case studies, the case study of fast food versus chefs and hospital administration, to ask the question, what are the structural forces in a system that cause administrators to drive out or stamp out Metis? We want to start by understanding a little bit more about the nature of Metis, according to this book. The nature of this on-the-ground knowledge that is responsive to its context and can only be understood from experience, from the inside, learned slowly over time. And so we're imagining learning to play tennis or learning to play soccer, or even things like running a business where you're responding to all these different people and all these different events and putting it together in your head. You have emergency staff and paramedics who are learning to respond to emergency situations in the moment. How do you talk to somebody who's in pain and who needs to do something, but it's complicated? All of that integrated knowledge that's sort of integrated through the human spirit, that is embedded in what Metis is. And it's really interesting that these two books kind of approach some of these issues in a very similar way. And of course, I'm obsessed with this book, The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist. And his chapter on intuition, or one of his chapters on intuition, really paints the same picture of how this works. So one similarity between the books is they both talk about rules of thumb. And they both say, yes, actually, Metis, or this intuition, does involve rules of thumb at first. When you're learning a skill, you learn from the coach or the other expert that you're watching, and they give you these rules of thumb to apply. But a lot of that expertise, that intuition, that Metis, comes from knowing when to apply the rule of thumb in this particular situation. So he even says the rule of thumb is kind of like grammar, whereas Metis is like actually speaking a language. And the grammar, of course, just learning grammar will not teach you how to speak a language. Now, another thing that both of these books point out about this phenomenon is that oftentimes it combines competition and cooperation in the same thing. So here we're thinking about a soccer game where you're deeply cooperating with your team to compete against another team. Or like martial arts where you're fighting against one another, but you're cooperating to have a good fight. There is an art to having a good fight. And the same thing is at play with intellectual conversations, where in intellectual conversations, you both have perspectives that are sort of competing, but you're competing in this way that's cooperating for both of you to learn and explore something together. And it's beautiful when it's done right. And the same thing is true with diplomacy or with marriage counseling. You might imagine the Metis of a marriage counselor who's listening carefully and balancing the competition and cooperation in this beautiful dynamic when it's done well. And this is actually one of the points I'm trying to make on this channel about game theory, is that game theory is not only about this left hemisphere apprehension power grab. Game theory is also at play in the most beautiful parts of human relationship, where it's more about feeling out a right relationship with the universe, if you allow me to be a little bit woo-woo about it. And okay, you're gonna have to just put up with me talking about this book a whole lot if you're watching this channel, but right hemisphere and left hemisphere thinking, like, the right hemisphere is this part where it's all about feeling out right relationship with the universe, whereas left hemisphere is about apprehending, it's about a power grab, it's about getting something. And both of those things have a game theory involved in them. And oftentimes they're slipping back and forth between the two. As a matter of fact, the right hemisphere, when it's feeling out how do I be in right relationship with the world, sometimes the right hemisphere may notice, actually, for me to live out my values in this situation, I need to hand over the reins to the left hemisphere to do something it's really good at doing, which is apprehending. But of course, his thesis is that what needs to happen is not get rid of the left hemisphere power grab, but rather to put it in balance such that the right hemisphere is the one that has more say. The part of us that is trying to be in right relationship with the world, that is the master, and the emissary comes in when the master recognizes that the emissary is the better person for the job. So both of those modes of being involve game theory. And if you're going to learn a good, healthy version of economics, you need to be able to think of it, both the right hemisphere, the intuitive version of economics, and also the left hemisphere power grab, and you need to be able to think about the movement back and forth between those. Another thing about Metis is that it is highly contextualized to its particular environment. So playing soccer with a particular group of people that you know how they operate, that's actually a little bit different than playing soccer with a completely different group where the dynamics would be different. And of course, some of the Metis skills of learning soccer are going to be very much transferable when you move to a new team. But other of those skills are particularized to the people. And you might imagine running a business is very much like this. You have a particular set of customers you're trying to attune to their needs, a particular set of employees, a particular industry environment that you have to know and understand. And if you pick up the CEO or the startup leader of one startup company and put them in a completely different industry with different people, some of the skills would transfer and others would not. Another thing that both of these authors say is that oftentimes the expert who has really deep skills in something, really deep levels of Metis, they cannot articulate their skill at all. And he tells this story about a doctor in the early 1900s who was really good at intuiting which patients would develop syphilis early in their stage before anybody had figured that out. So the hospital administrators, they wanted to know, what is the trick? How does this doctor do this? But the doctor couldn't tell them. He's just sort of like, it's just my intuition. So what the administrators did is that they had other doctors follow this doctor around and watch what was going on when this doctor was diagnosing people with syphilis or not. And what the doctors watching figured out was it was an eye tremor. When the eye was trembling a little bit, that was an early sign of syphilis. And so that could then be encoded into these centralized, systemized places where the hospital administrators could have this on a checklist doctors could watch out for. But initially it came from the Metis, that just paying attention, that attunement skill of that one doctor. And McGilchrist is a doctor, and he's spent time on the ward with patients. And he says one of the most important things to pay attention to is when a nurse says she's worried about a particular patient. That's something that matters oftentimes more than a checklist from the administrators, especially if that nurse has spent a lot of time with patients and has years of experience to build up her intuition. Now, I want to return to this question of how do these centralized style systems crowd out or engineer out the Metis? How do they crowd out this beautiful on-the-ground knowledge? And to think about that, we need to think about, what do we mean by a centralized system here? And this comes, of course, from this book, Seeing Like a State, which is looking at cases where administrative states try to impose their utopian vision on societies. And he's basically looking at what goes wrong when that happens. Now, in this case, you can view the administrative state as being the top of a hierarchy and people on the ground as being the bottom of the hierarchy. The language he actually uses is the center. The administrative state is in the center, and the on-the-ground stuff is on the edges, is a different way of conceptualizing this. And it actually goes along with this book, which is another book I'm obsessed with, The New Industrial State by John Kenneth Galbraith. And I think both of these help us to think about, what do we mean by centralized system, and why does this feel like it fits with today's system, which is not a Soviet-style centralized system, but it's something else. And what I'd like to do as we go through some of these cases is to pull out some specific structural forces that drive the stamping out of Metis. And the first of these is going to be a power dynamic between the center and the edges, where if you let Metis be a big part of the system, that empowers people on the edges and disempowers people who are operating from an administrative role in the center. Let me give you a quote from this book. Artisan guilds, gifted craftsmen, certain classes, religious fraternities, entire communities, and men in general often treat some forms of knowledge as a monopoly they are reluctant to share. So the reason some of these groups might be reluctant to share their Metis, their kind of knowledge, is that they know having that knowledge means people have to come to them. It gives them a little bit of power, a little bit of sway. And you might imagine in a workers' union, if you have a bunch of chefs where the quality of the restaurant and the reputation of the restaurant restaurant depends on having these 5 chefs who really know what they're doing, those 5 chefs can actually demand a higher salary. They have way more negotiation power with the firm that they work for than in a case like fast food restaurants where you can just switch out one worker for another. And if any of the workers try to unionize, you can just be like, hey, you're easily replaceable because you don't have knowledge that we need. So the lack of Metis inherently empowers the center, which is one reason why if there is power that's located with administrative states, they will have a tendency to want to disempower things they can't control. Now, how does central planning relate to our current system? And he really does the best job of explaining this. He kind of makes the argument that we live in a centrally planned system. It's just not the Soviet-style centrally planned system where you have a group of people that are controlling it from the center. Like, who is controlling the existing system we have? It's this network of intertwined bureaucracies, and that includes both corporate bureaucracies and government bureaucracies that are deeply intertwined with one another. So it's this collectively determined thing, but it's collectively determined from a centralized standpoint of people who operate in these circles of power inside corporations and inside the government and their social will collectively. And I will link below and at the end to my video on this book, which explains in more detail. But let's turn back to our fast food versus fancy chef restaurant to get another example of a structural force that's going to drive the stamping out of Metis. And here we want to think about instances of food poisoning in restaurants and how that is handled. And of course, the responsibility for food poisoning doesn't often lie on the worker who accidentally did something, accidentally didn't wash their hands or whatnot. The locus of responsibility there really is at the administrative level. Those are going to be the people who are paying the bills and going through the court cases and dealing with the public relations. So their focus, their energy is on stamping out all of the possible bad things that could happen through every means they have. And there is a bit of a trade-off here when it comes to the amount of agency and control that administrators allow the food workers to have. Because if you take away all of their control, you can kind of control out the worst possible case scenarios. But you also control out the possibility for them to be able to learn on the job and bring that creative energy, that Metis, to their work. And another concept I use a lot on this channel is the salience frame concept, where salience is really about what is in sharp focus, what is prominent in someone's thinking, in someone's motivation, and what things are they not really thinking about, what things are on the fuzzy edges of their lens. And if we think from an administrator's standpoint, the instance of food preparation that went wrong, the bad cases, that's really prominent on the lens of the administrators. But the quality of the food that's kind of subtle and hard to describe, and it's this experiential thing that customers get and that happens between the chefs and the customers, that's not really something that's super prominent to an administrator. And part of this has to do with loss aversion. It's the fact that people feel losses or feel bad things way more strongly, way more emotionally than they feel good things. Good things are kind of subtle and they percolate on our consciousness, but they don't force themselves on our consciousness so much. So for the administrators, the positive parts of having a really good, really skilled chef, that's not on their salience frame, while the negative stuff really is. And part of the answer to our question, why do administrators stamp out Metis, is that they're trying to do something good. They're trying so hard to stamp out that bad thing that they end up stamping out the essence of the good things they're trying to bring about too. And this brings us to our healthcare administration example. And I have to admit here, I'm going to have to control myself because this is the bread and butter of what I teach in class. I'm a healthcare economist, and this stuff goes really, really deep. So we're just going to scratch the surface here. But there is actually a right place for administration. I'm not making the case get rid of all healthcare administration ever. I'm not making the case get rid of all states ever, and neither are either of these authors. It's really about a balanced relationship that empowers, where the centralized force, whether that's a healthcare administrative force or some other state force, where that empowers the Metis and rather than pulling power toward itself. That's really what it's about. And in thinking about a healthy healthcare administration, we might imagine that there's a balance of power between the administration and the doctors. In some ways, the balance of the relationship between doctors or providers of various sorts and administration should have the doctors with their Metis and their on-the-ground knowledge kind of in the asymmetric role where the administration is really there to serve and to empower and to facilitate a smooth functioning of the system as doctors work together and practitioners work together. And this kind of relates to the book The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. This is an ancient Chinese text. And it's both about sort of ways of being in the world that are well attuned to one's relationship with the universe and that sort of move on top of that rather than exerting a lot of power against. Where the bad version of healthcare administration exerts a lot of power against doctors and against their Metis. So the question is, how does that happen? How do these really well-intended healthcare administrators end up using so much force to crowd out the value that doctors bring to the table? Now, in considering the balance between doctors and administrators, both of those actually have Metis. It's not just doctors that have their Metis based on years of experience observing patients. That's really clear. But hospital administrators also have a Metis that is kind of like the Metis of a CEO who's operating on top of many people and many systems and watching with this feedback for what's working and not working. And hospital administrators, they have policies they implement, like hand washing policies and policies related to how to structure the information environment, what goes into the medical records, who sees what information when. And a good hospital administrator is going to implement a policy and watch and get feedback and sort of operate on top of systems that they are deeply in touch with in an intuitive Metis kind of sense. Both of these actors do have Metis. And both doctors and administrators are fallible. As a matter of fact, it would be nice to say, okay, they're fallible in a way that balances each other out, where the administrators ideally would catch things that are systematically going wrong with doctors and change their information environment to fix those problems. That's a really good balancing out role of administrators. And same with doctors. Doctors can give administrators feedback and be like, wait a second, this policy that seemed great is actually harming the doctor-patient relationship. There is this symbiotic relationship where there can be a balancing out of the biases. But on the other hand, both of those are subject to biases that are from the financial structures of the system. And unfortunately, the financial structure biases are going to go in the same direction with doctors and administrators. That's just a feature of the system we live in. But really now, back to this question of why do these administrators oftentimes crowd out the Metis of doctors they rely on? And the third structural force driving this is going to be the salience of the positive things that administrators are doing. And to explain this, I'm going to use an example that captures the relationship between healthcare administrators and the academic research. So part of administrators' jobs is to watch the research coming out of universities and to try to figure out how do we take that information and implement it into practice with doctors. And a typical study might say this particular treatment X, has an average of a 2% improvement in some patient health outcome. But the problem here is this doesn't mean that all patients get a 2% improvement when they use that particular treatment. What it actually means is that 1 in 40 patients get an 80% improvement from that treatment, and the other 39 patients get no improvement. And of course, no treatment is going to have 0 side effects. So you might also have, okay, 1 in 5 patients has this mild negative side effect. And the real art of medical practice, for doctors at least, part of their Metis is figuring out which of these patients will be that 1 in 40 who will have a huge improvement in patient outcomes based on this, and which are probably not going to respond well to this and will be really annoyed by the side effects of the medication or whatnot. That's part of the job of doctors, is figuring out which patients fit into which categories. But from an administrator's standpoint, the more patients they can get to do this treatment, the more good they're doing by giving all of these patients a 2% improvement that is the average of this study. And you might imagine these meetings where the administrators get together and look at their numbers and give each other a high five for their success rates. They're like, actually, we got 20% of the patients to adopt this technology. Patients who adopt that technology on average get 2% better. So they're celebrating essentially the adoption of this treatment rather than patients getting better, because patients getting better, that's not very measurable usually. Patients getting better is sort of, how does the patient feel? How well are they doing in their daily lives at managing their illness? There's not that many metrics that are great metrics of patient health, because health is hard to measure. So they end up measuring their success by adoption of this technology rather than by an astute and careful matching of the patient to the treatment. Moreover, the harms done through the side effects of treatment X, that data generally does not get collected, and especially since somebody has money to make based on this treatment being deployed, so there's not an incentive to collect good data on patient harms done. And of course, harms done is also very hard to measure. If the side effect is a stomach ache, do you really know that it was that treatment as opposed to something the person ate? This is really messy when you get to the on-the-ground level. So the systemic point I'm making here is that from an administrator standpoint, they think a lot about the success of what they do, and it's very salient to them if their success is get this thing deployed rather than getting it deployed correctly. And so enforcing the deployment of something without the matching of that thing to the context, that is one of these disconnects that causes a system to stamp out the Metis. And then a fourth structural factor at play is the fact that Metis is fairly invisible from a centralized standpoint. So can the doctors do a good job of communicating to the administrators, wait a second, I didn't give that patient the treatment because my intuition said they would really hate the side effects based on their body language and the things they talked about annoyed them from past treatments. It's kind of very difficult to talk about why a doctor made a particular judgment to say, wait a second, I think this patient is going to be in one of the 39 who won't respond and will be a patient who's really annoyed by the side effects. That kind of knowledge is difficult to communicate between these groups, between the doctor and the administrator. And on top of all of that dynamics, you do have this power dynamic where the people with the power are generally the people at the center, and they have the power to impose their will, and oftentimes that will be what happens.